This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 40 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry, and for today's episode, we'll be looking at recommendations for players you should not be afraid to start in Week 11. Now, every week with this episode, we'd like to target quarterbacks and tight ends who are outside the top 10 in the ESPN weekly rankings, and then for the running back and wide receiver position, target players outside the top 20. And of course, this is designed to help you with some start-sit decisions as we head into Week 11. Now, before we get started, I want to remind you, you can follow and interact with the show on Twitter. We are at FFAlchemistPod. Now verified, again, we are at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email the show any questions at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now let's start with the quarterback position here for Week 11, because according to ESPN rankings, I actually like all the quarterbacks between quarterback 11 through quarterback 14. In order, that would be Kyler Murray at 11, Josh Dobbs at 12, Joe Burrow at 13, and Justin Fields at 14. Now, the two that I like the most, I'm going to start with Justin Fields at quarterback 14. Now, of course, he hasn't played since leaving midway through his game in Week 6. Of course, it is announced that he will be returning to action in Week 11 in Detroit. Now, through the first 3 weeks of the season, Justin Fields and the rest of the Bears offense, they looked miserable. However, Fields turned it around. He looked excellent in weeks 4 and 5. He finished as quarterback 3 and quarterback 1 in those 2 weeks. He averaged over 30 points a game in that 2-game sample prior to his injury. On top of that, in his first 6 games, Justin Fields is averaging 8 rushing attempts in 40 yards rushing. And of course, in that 2-game sample where he blew up before his injury, he had 8 total passing touchdowns. And then as it relates to his opponent, the Lions are 22nd in opposing points to quarterbacks this season. My second quarterback recommendation is Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray, who is quarterback 11 this week. He is playing the Texans, who are 19th in points against opposing quarterbacks this year. Now, of course, last week was his first game back from the late season ACL tear last year, and I thought Murray looked really good. I think he showed a lot of mobility in and out of the pocket. Most importantly, he had 33 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. He scored 18 fantasy points, but I still think there's more upside to be observed. His completion percentage was lower than his career average, and for his career, he averages almost 2 touchdowns a game. He only had 1 rushing touchdown on Sunday, and yet was close to his career 20-point scoring average. I still think there is a lot of fantasy fruit to be realized with Kyler Murray the rest of the season. So I like Fields the most, Murray second, and then the third option is going to be Josh Dobbs, who is quarterback 12 this week. Now, on paper, the Broncos are 25th in points against opposing quarterbacks, but that has drastically shifted in recent weeks. The Broncos have been much better defensively. Case in point, some of their most recent matchups. Last week against Josh Allen, he only had 14 points. Patrick Mahomes had 6 points in Week 8. He had 17 points in Week 6. Jordan Love only had 15 in between those 2 games. Now, as for Josh Dobbs, he does have 3 straight games between 23 to 25 fantasy points. One of those were in Arizona, of course, the last 2 in Minnesota. He also has 4 straight games with a rushing touchdown. And most importantly, since Week 6, Josh Dobbs has consistently been between 6 to 8 rushing attempts a game. When you add in the rushing touchdowns, Dobbs is averaging 9 fantasy points a game just from his rushing. In all, I like all 3 of those options ahead of Brock Purdy, Tua Tagovailoa, and Sam Howell. All 3 of those guys are ranked ahead of the 3 players I mentioned in this week's episode. Now, for the wide receiver position this week, I have 3 recommendations, and the first one is going to be a quarterback wide receiver stack. So I already talked about Justin Fields. Now we need to talk about DJ Moore, who is currently wide receiver 22. Now, for the matchup, Detroit is 22nd in points to opposing wide receivers on the season. And from weeks 2 to 5, when Justin Fields was the quarterback, DJ Moore had 8 targets a game. He was dominating team target share and, most importantly, air yardage share. He had 5 total touchdowns in that span, and he had 2 top 5 weekly finishes at the position. Now, Moore's target volume had dropped slightly without Justin Fields, but most importantly, his air yardage had dropped sharply. But with Fields back, I think we can move DJ Moore safely back inside the top 20 of the weekly rankings. Now, option 2 is going to be Houston rookie Tank Dell, currently wide receiver 26. Now, we still have not seen all 4 Houston wide receivers play together this year, but as of this recording on Thursday afternoon, Dell is the healthiest of the group. Nico Collins missed last week. He is questionable again for week 11. And as of this recording, Noah Brown and Robert Woods are both listed as questionable. They did not practice on Wednesday. As for Dell, the last 2 weeks, he has 25 total targets with 3 touchdowns and 48 points the last 2 weeks. Tank Dell is wide receiver 5 in points per game over the last 2 weeks. And the last option is going to be a deeper recommendation. This is probably your at least 12 team, if not 14 or 16 team recommendation. But Gabe Davis at wide receiver 39, I think, is your boom bust recommendation. Now, on paper, the Jets have given up the fewest points to opposing wide receivers. But of course, we now have a change in offensive coordinator. Ken Dorsey is out. There's definitely some desperation setting in Buffalo. Now, the reason I'm bringing Davis up is because the other players in his range, in that late 30, early 40 range right now for wide receiver rankings, none of them have the fantasy ceiling that Gabe Davis does. When he gets at least 7 targets, he has scored over 20 fantasy points. He is 3 for 3 on the season in those instances. And there's no other player in this range that has that ceiling. Not Jerry Jeudy, Christian Watson, JSN, George Pickens with Deontay back. So if you're projected to lose this week and you need to kind of swing for the fences with a flex spot this week, I think Gabe Davis is the guy that could potentially get you there. So we'll move on and talk about the running back position this week. First, let's talk about the Miami backfield, because it looks like De'Von Achane is going to return to action. He's currently running back 18 on the week. Teammate Raheem Mostert is also listed as running back 25. They'll be hosting the Las Vegas Raiders. They are 25th in opposing points to running backs this year. Now, as of this recording, it does remain to be seen officially if De'Von Achane will be active in Week 11, but my working assumption is that he will be. And sensational doesn't even begin to describe Achane's first 3 games. His yards per carry at 12.1 is almost twice as high as the next running back in the league. His yards before contact is 8.1. His yards after contact is 4.0. Both are league best. He has the best missed tackle rate in the league combined with blazing speed. And it's just like we've hit the fantasy jackpot if you're holding him. Now, Achane has only played 3 games, and he is still running back 27 overall. Of course, he's running back 1 on a points per game basis. And how he is ranked this week as running back 18 is quite frankly beyond me. He should be well inside the top 10 in his position rankings. Now, as for Mostert, he's currently running back 25 this week, and in the event that Achane were not to return this week, then I think Mostert's ranking would certainly climb towards that running back 20 territory. But even if Achane does return, keep in mind that the 3-game sample with Achane, Mostert and Achane, they were splitting snaps pretty evenly, and both were producing for fantasy. Mostert scored 65 points in that 3-game sample with Achane. Granted, one of those games was the Denver game where they both went for over 40, but even if you take that out and look at the other 2 games, Mostert still averaged 10 fantasy points. So if Achane is out, Mostert is a must start. And even if Achane is in, I still think Mostert is still an option as your running back 2 or flex this week. Now we'll pivot and talk about Brian Robinson Jr. of the Washington Commanders. He's listed as running back 21 this week. He's got the New York Giants, who are 22nd in opposing points to the running back position this year. As for Robinson, he is inside the top 10 in total scoring so far this year, and he's inside the top 20 on a points per game basis. Now Robinson has been playing around 50% of snaps all season, but in games where he's played over 50% of snaps, and typically this is somewhere between 50 to 60%, Robinson is averaging over 17 fantasy points per game. And Robinson already has 8 total touchdowns on the year, well ahead of his 3 touchdown total from last year. Now the Commanders are most likely looking at a positive game script against the Little Giants on Sunday, and I expect Robinson to get more than the 50% of snaps in what should be more of a run-oriented game plan than we have typically seen from the pass-heavy Commanders in recent weeks. Then the other running back who is looking like a smash start this week is Texans running back Devin Singletary. He's listed right now as running back 29 for the matchup. They are hosting the Arizona Cardinals, who are 30th in opposing points to the running back position. Teammate Dameon Pierce, he has missed the last 2 weeks, and he has yet to practice this week, indicating a third straight game missed, I think, is likely at this point. And with Pierce out, Singletary is playing about 80% of snaps, and most importantly, he has 98% of all running back opportunities in the last 2 weeks. Now, last week, Singletary had 160 total yards with a touchdown, good for 23 fantasy points. Assuming Pierce is out again, Singletary should be much closer to a top 20 ranking. Now, as for the tight end position, finding a player outside the top 10 this week is going to be pretty difficult. And the main reason for that is because I think the market has already caught up with the recommendations we've had for the last few weeks. So if you had been listening to this show, you would know that we've been pretty high on guys like Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, and Trey McBride, guys we had recommended for many weeks prior to this week. So hopefully you were able to at least claim one of those players earlier this season, so you're not staring at a decision right now on what to do. But if you need a dart throw outside the top 10, the player I would turn to is Luke Musgrave, the rookie tight end for the Packers. He's listed as tight end 15 this week. Now, since his return from injury following the Packers Week 6 bye, Musgrave is playing over 70% of snaps. He's getting between 4 to 5 targets a game. Now, it is hard to recommend any Packers in your starting lineup right now, but Musgrave is playing starter snaps, and when he does get looks, they are typically downfield, and he has a very strong matchup. The Chargers are 28th in points against to opposing tight ends this year. So that'll wrap up episode 40 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe. We'll be back with a trio of episodes next week. We'll look at waiver wire targets ahead of Week 12. We'll do a full recap with key observations and trends from Week 11. And then again, we'll look to target players you shouldn't be afraid to start in Week 12. So for Dustin Chandry, signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.